It makes it hard for people who live in the city to go out and go to the church. Why would you build it away from where the people are living? There's one obvious reason, because as we saw in Ostia, what do they always put outside the city walls? Cemeteries, graves. So when you have a church outside the walls, it means it's not a congregational church like for people to come to go to church. It's a church, it's called a martyrion. It's a church that's over the grave of an apostle or a martyr or somebody prominent in the Christian faith. So that's what this church is. The reason it's here, this church is on the Ostian Way. It's on the road, the ancient road that went from Ostia, where we just were, into the city. And this is where the Apostle Paul was martyred. And then it was a graveyard and they buried him. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about Paul. In the Bible, there's no account of Paul dying, right? He's in the book of Acts. He ends the book of Acts. He's still alive. He's under house arrest, and hopefully we're going to go to the church that's over the place where he was under house arrest on Wednesday, if we get a chance. It's in the Jewish quarter. So that's for another day. So he's still alive. So what happened to Paul after Acts 28? Well, if you're reading my book After Acts, that's what it's about. You know, what do the traditions say? And the best we can reconstruct is that probably Paul was released from his prison, his house arrest, in 62 AD. Nobody came from Jerusalem to press charges. They waited 2 years. Nothing happened. They said, go ahead, you can leave. So now we know that Paul desperately wanted to go to Spain. And he even tells the Romans, I'm coming to see you, but really I'm not coming to see you. I just want you to give me charity because I want to go to Spain. Now, why was he so intense about Spain? Why would Paul think that Spain is just because it's beautiful, nice culture? What is it about Spain in the Roman mindset? Spain would represent what to a person in the Roman Empire? The end of the world. As far as you can go, there's nothing past it, as far as they knew. And Paul said, I want to go where no one has ever brought the gospel. So Spain was so symbolic. To him, it meant the gospel has gone to the world, because he didn't know about America. So he might have gone to Spain. You know, it's not actually very hard to get to certain parts of Spain from Rome if you kind of stay within the Mediterranean, but there's not a lot of evidence about that, and so maybe he did, but nothing really took root there. So he came back into the Greece and Crete and that area, and that's where he wrote 1 Timothy and Titus. And then somehow he gets back to Rome. Now some people think, well, they rearrested him. I actually think he might have come by his own free will to Rome, because there was a terrible fire in Rome in 64 AD. Rome burned. And I don't think they dragged him back. I think Paul probably came back to try to bring some charity. But somehow he ends up back here in Rome, and Nero is alive at that time. And Paul, at some point, meets with Nero, because the book of Acts says, an angel says, you must meet with Nero. So at some point, he actually interacted with Nero. But, you know, Nero wasn't any fan of the Christian faith. And so now we're getting into traditions, but solid traditions, that the Apostle Paul was killed under the reign of Nero, just before Nero died, so maybe around 66 or 67 AD. Now here you have traditions about it. So I have here on my phone, this is my own translation of an ancient text called the Acts of Paul. And the Acts of Paul include the story of his martyrdom. I'll just tell you what this tradition says. This is from the 2nd century. It's pretty early. Could well be true. And so there's these two soldiers, Longus and Cestus, and they were really wanting Paul to share the gospel. And he said, well, I'm about to be martyred, but come to my grave when I die, because Luke and Titus will be there, and they'll share the gospel with you guys. So, you know, I can't do it, like they're about to kill me, but come to my grave. I got some peeps that are going to give you the gospel. So Longus and Cestus have to wait. These two soldiers have to wait. So the death of Paul says this: Paul turned to face the east, Lifting up his hands to heaven, he prayed for a long time. After he had communed prayerfully with the fathers in Hebrew, he offered his neck without another word. And the executioner struck off his head, and milk spurted onto the soldier's tunic. Now this milk is hard to interpret. What's milk doing coming out of his head? Which, by the way, you never used an axe. The soldiers that executed people by beheading, what kind of blade did they use? If you don't know, just look right there. They cut off his head with a sword. And always in Christian art, you always depict a martyr holding the emblem of their martyrdom, and Paul's always depicted with a sword. Others are depicted with, Lawrence was roasted on a gridiron, so he has a gridiron always. He's holding like a grill. Bartholomew, you know what he holds? We'll be in the Sistine Chapel. What's Bartholomew holding? His own skin, because he was flayed alive. Yeah. But anyway, Paul's emblem is a sword. So he struck it off. What's the milk? Like the pure teaching of the word. It's probably something relating to his teaching, right? Because in Scripture, milk, is the milk of the word. So that may be what that is. But anyway, when the soldiers and all the bystanders saw this martyrdom, they marveled and glorified God who had given Paul such honor. Then they departed to give an account of these events to Caesar, to Nero. So when Nero heard the news, he was astonished, and he didn't know what to say. And many philosophers and centurions were standing around with Caesar, and suddenly Paul appeared to them around the 9th hour. So Paul's like a resurrection appearance of Paul according to this text. And facing them, he said, "Caesar, behold me here, Paul, the soldier of God. I'm not dead, but alive in my God. But for you, O wretched man, there will be many troubles and great punishments, because only a few days ago you unjustly spilled the blood of the righteous." So Paul, the story anyway, says he came back from the dead and got in Nero's face and said, "God's judgment is going to be upon you." And Nero was so terribly upset by what he heard that he ordered the release of all the Christian prisoners that he had in jail. And then, of course, just as Paul had directed, Longus and Cestus, these soldiers, they did what he said. They went to Paul's grave, his tomb, in trepidation, and as they drew near, they saw two men praying, and Paul was there in between. So another appearance of Paul. At the sight of this miracle, they were overwhelmed. But when it was Titus and Luke were the two men, so when Titus and Luke turned to these two soldiers, those guys get frightened. They think, uh-oh, they're here to get us, or they're going to run away. But no, Longus and Cestus say, we're not chasing you for death. We want to hear the gospel. And so, of course, the story ends that Titus and Luke, instead of being frightened, turn to these soldiers, share the gospel with them, and they come to eternal salvation. So it's showing basically that even though Paul's dead, he's passing on the legacy. And that's what we just heard. One of our guides said, I don't know if both of them said it, notice the four corners. You see the four corners of this courtyard? Empty pedestal, empty pedestal, empty pedestal. Oh, that one's not empty. Now when you see fours in Christian architecture, it's usually a gospel, the four gospels. So you would expect each of the four gospel writers with their symbol to be on these four pedestals. But here, it's just Luke. Because as Paul says in 2 Timothy, only Luke is with me. And so Luke, the associate of Paul, is depicted right there. So let me just finish by telling you about this church that we're about to go in and see. It's a lovely church. It's massive. Where did it come from? So when Paul was beheaded, somewhere around here, a Christian lady, usually associated with a lady named Lucina, which means light, she owned a grave here, and she buried him properly. We know that within about I'd say 110 years after his burial, within about that time, there was some kind of monument on top of the grave of Paul so that people wouldn't forget it. As oral memories began to fade, as mouth-to-mouth memories, they said, we need to build something, and they called it a trophy. Because what's a trophy? A sign of victory. So they built some kind of monument, because the deacon here in Rome says, if you want to know where Paul's grave is, go to the Ostian Road and look at the trophy. If you want to know where Peter's grave is, go to the Vatican Hill and look at the trophy there. So something was here marking the grave of Paul. So then when Emperor Constantine in the 4th century comes to power, he says, well, let's put a church over this. Like, let's have it where you can come and visit this. And he made a little chapel over wherever the trophy was. We don't know what the trophy looked like. It was just a marking structure of some kind. So Constantine right here built a little chapel, and it worked for a while, but so many people were coming to see it that later Emperor Theodosius at the end of the 4th century said, let's forget chapel. Let's make a huge church. And so they built a church of the scale of this church over the grave of Paul, and they put the altar right over it. And that church lasted from the 4th century without really being disturbed until 1823. So for all those centuries, the existence of a trophy and then a chapel and then a big church marked the spot of Paul's grave, which is why in After Acts I give a report card, how likely are these different traditions of being true? And I give it a grade. And how true is it that what we're going to see in here, that little grave actually has Paul's bones inside of it? I gave it a B+. Like, not an A, like you can't know for sure, but it's a pretty good grade. In other words, what I'm saying to you is that there's a pretty decent chance that the little box that you're going to be able to look at under the altar, the burial remains of Paul are in there. Not that that's magical or something, but it gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of continuity. It's not fake. It's not Narnia. These things aren't made up. They happened, you know, and it's real. So it's possible. Yeah, I think that's probably enough. As we go inside, you'll see different aspects. You'll just marvel at the grandeur and the beauty. So I said it burned down in 1823. So this is the one that they've rebuilt to be in the place of the one that burned down in 1823.
When someone comes to the Lord, one of the things that we often do is we give them a booklet about how to grow in the spiritual life, how to begin the spiritual life, right?
Yes.
But one of the things I appreciated about Don and George Sweeting is they wrote a book on how to finish the Christian life. And I think that they gave some great principles, good book, but I think a great place to get some answers to that question of how to finish well is from the Apostle Paul. This is the place where likely, not certainly, but likely we see his remains where he was martyred, and this is a memorial. So I thought it'd be good to look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. This was written by Paul to Timothy in Ephesus. Timothy was in Ephesus. Paul was here in prison, second imprisonment, when he wrote this. So it was not the imprisonment in Acts, not when he was in Caesarea, but afterwards. He comes back, and here's what he tells us about how we too can finish well. Okay? How do we finish well? By the way, I never used to care about finishing well. You know, first I was too young, and then I was middle-aged. It's amazing how middle-age lasted so long. It was about 2 years ago I thought, hey, I'm not in the middle anymore. I've got just a few more years. How do I finish well became a question that I was thinking of, and this passage is a great idea for those of us who realize where we're at in our age, okay? How to finish well. Here's what he says. First of all, I think it would be wise for us to consider the present, to keep offering ourselves to God. It says, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering. This is 2 Timothy 4:6. I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time for my departure is close. He says, I am being poured out as a drink offering. What is a drink offering? In the Torah, there would be sacrifices, like a burnt offering, where they would mix it with grain, flour, oil, and then pour a drink offering of wine over it before the burnt offering. And the wine would be, the fermentation in the wine would cause that offering to go up in smoke. It was a form of an offering. And Paul sees his life coming to a close, and he sees it as a continuous offering, even to the very end. And I think that that's the great model for us, that we need to continue offering ourselves to God. Romans 12:1 and 2 talks about presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice. We never get to retire from offering ourselves to the Lord. That's just not something to do. So I'll tell you, this is a true story. Doc Sweeting, when he retired from Moody as chancellor, he became chancellor emeritus, but became pastor of senior citizens at a church in the northwest suburbs. And then he finally retired when he was 94. And he asked me personally, to preach at the service that they were having to celebrate his retirement. I was so impressed with myself. George Sweeting asked me to preach at his retirement. I told that to Eva. She said, don't be so impressed. Everyone else he knows is dead. He was 94. And but I went to that service, and I was sitting, there was a meal afterwards, and I said, so Doc, what are you going to do now that you're retired? He said, I'm not retiring. I'm just not going to work here anymore. He says, you can't ever retire from serving the Lord. He said, I've got about 4 or 5 books left in me, and I can't do all the stuff I'm doing here and write. And he revised one book and did another book and did his memoir. So I think he finished 3 of the books before he passed. But he didn't retire. He, to the very end, was presenting himself as an offering. And I think that's what Paul's perspective is about. He's being poured out as a drink offering to the very end. And that's what our perspective should be. Not to retire from serving God. We can retire from our jobs, but never from our service to the Lord. So as we consider the present, that's what we have to do. Keep offering ourselves to God. And then if we're going to finish well, we have to review the past. Look at verse 7. I have fought the good fight. These are all past tenses. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He sees himself near the end now, and he looks back at the legacy he had. He reflects on his past, and he said he stayed faithful. Truthfully, that's become something that's become much more important to me, to look at the legacy of my past. I don't want to look back at the past with failure, with abandonment, with betrayal of the Lord. I want to look back at my life with faithfulness. And that's really one of my great hopes. And one of the things I love is I have had the privilege of studying with people in ministry. I've mentioned Ed Bloom, who did a book with me. I was his graduate assistant in seminary. He's 87 years old. I call him every couple of months. He says, I said, what are you doing? Well, I preached last week. He tells me, I'm studying theology. He tells me what books I should read, which I think, oh, that's in German. I'm sorry, not going to do that. But the thing I love about people like him and many of these other great teachers that I've had, they're now up in their 80s, and they're not just continuing to serve, but they look back at a lifetime of faithfulness, so that when the Lord does call them, they will look back, just like Paul, and see a lifetime of faithfulness. I think we don't have to be faithful theologians. What we have to be is faithful to what God has called us to do. We have to look back at our lives. Some of us, it might be, I was faithful in helping young women serve the Lord. I was faithful in mentoring young women. I was faithful in encouraging others at services, just to welcome others. We all have aspects of our life where God has called us to serve, not just to be theologians, but to serve in our local church and all that. And what we want to do is look back at a legacy of faithfulness, that we stay true to the faith and stay true to service. That's what we're looking at as we finish our years. Let's look back for consistent faithfulness. So in the present, we keep offering ourselves, and we reflect on the past. We're going to stay faithful. Keep looking at that legacy of faithfulness. And then Paul says that we should anticipate the future. There's reserved for me in the future the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. Paul anticipated this legacy of faithfulness that he had in the past. The continual offering of himself to serve God would lead in the future to a crown that he would receive, a reward from the Lord. You know, sometimes I think, I don't want to think that way. Oh, I'm going to get a reward. I don't want to think that way, because I really do believe in that parable. We're only slaves doing that which is required. We're only unworthy slaves. Only doing that which is required. I think that's the great grace of God. Every time we think we've only done what's the minimum, he says, boy, that's what I wanted from you. And there's a crown of righteousness available to us. You say, well, that was for Paul, because he was a martyr. He was an apostle. But look what he says. That there's a future crown of righteousness which the Lord, the righteous judge will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. You know who that is? If we love his appearing, it's us. If we're looking to his return and to be faithful to him till his return or till we see him, it's talking about us. We are all promised a crown of righteousness for faithfulness. It's not, you don't have to be an apostle. Thank God for that, because, you know, we don't have to be martyrs. We just have to love his appearing and live for him. That's what the future lays up for us. I'm convinced too, just like the 24 elders in Revelation will throw those crowns at his feet and say, only you're worthy. But nevertheless, he does promise us a righteous reward. The most important decision we can make at most of our ages is this one. Not to start out well, not to stay on the path, but to keep looking to the future and to end well. That's what we're looking at. I want to be one that doesn't blow up at the end, but stays faithful to the end. I know that's what we all want, because we love his appearing, and then we'll receive that reward. So I think we can use the Apostle Paul's, almost his last words, as a great reminder. How he ended well, we can end well as well.
Of Daniel and the lion here below.